Good afternoon, good evening. Welcome to our Bible study for Wednesday, the 30th of December, 2020. The year is fast getting away from us. We're having a good study here in the study of the prophecy and the prophets, Brother Gene Taylor's lesson that covers a lot of territory concerning the prophets and their prophecies. We've worked our way through quite a few now into where we are now with the minor prophets. Last week we finished up with the prophet Hosea, and now we're going to take a look at Micah. Micah is the one that we'll be dealing with for a few weeks now. Micah has a lot of information that relates to the fall of the people of Israel and of Judah. So we'll be taking a look at that over the next few weeks, and hopefully those weeks will be our in-person class studies. We're due to start back this Sunday, January the 3rd, with our regularly scheduled in-person class meetings and worship services at the church building there at Bagdad. In the meantime, we appreciate all of you for joining in for these recorded studies. And of course, we will continue to record and post the Bible classes and the sermons for the Sunday service for the benefit of anyone who is not able to or does not see it safe enough to get out and join us personally. And that's another point we'd like to make, that if you do not feel safe and comfortable coming and joining in with personal services, then please be safe. Don't push yourself to do anything that would make you feel uncomfortable or put you at risk. We do know that there is beginning to be some availability of the vaccines for the COVID. So if you have an opportunity to get the vaccination, then I would suggest doing so. And once it's known to be effective for you, then you could safely get out and join in with these in-person services. For this evening, we'd like to start out by just looking at some general information about the man, Micah. Micah is an interesting character. His name is one that, like we said, most prophets' names have something to do with their character or their job or their goal or their mission. Micah's name is translated variously. Mainly it means "who is like Jehovah," and that indicates a kind of an elevating of God in the purpose of Micah. This man would have, as I think one source from Baker's Introduction to the Bible says, that Micah was certainly a God-exalting prophet. So Micah's name, "who is like Jehovah." If you take your Bible and turn to the book of Micah, he even references a phrase kind of like this in chapter 7 and verse 18. As we begin looking at this, his name, "who is like Jehovah," over in chapter 7, near the end of this letter, verse 18, he writes, "Who is a God like you, pardoning iniquity and passing over the transgression of the remnant of his heritage? He does not retain his anger forever, because he delights in mercy." The very beginning of that verse, "Who is a God like you?" You could almost translate that as Micah's name itself. So in his effort to work as a prophet designated by God, we know that Micah's goal was the same as any other prophet. The goal of the prophets was to turn people back to God. That was their mission. The method by which he carried it out was also directed by God. Micah's preaching was the thing that God wanted carried out for his people. And so as Micah begins to preach, we see the statements that he makes referring to a need for the people to change, and also this very, very stern pronouncement of destruction if they don't. Where was Micah from? We know that all of the prophets pretty much had some location that you could pinpoint as their origin, and Micah is said to be from the city of Moresheth Gath. Moresheth Gath. And if you turn back to Micah, the first chapter, it says here, "The word of the Lord that came to Micah of Moresheth in the days of Jotham, Ahaz, Hezekiah," and so on. Well, Moresheth is not a name that we're very familiar with. So let's take a look at a map, if you will. I've got a map on the next page here, and we'll see if we can enlarge that just a little bit so that you can see better what we're talking about. You know that this would represent the whole, both kingdoms of Palestine. Ephraim, or Israel, in the north, the 10 tribes, and Judah, the kingdom in the south, the 2 tribes of Benjamin and Judah. So you see here's Moresheth, and it is nearby Gath. Gath is a pretty famous place. Gath was one of the Philistine cities back in those days of the divided kingdom, and Moresheth was kind of like a suburb of it. So when the Bible says that Micah was from Moresheth Gath, probably what they're talking about, he was from Moresheth, which belongs to Gath. Like Milton is a suburb of Pensacola, maybe something like that. But this indicates something about where he came from. Moresheth Gath was not one of your major urban centers. He wasn't an urbanite like perhaps Isaiah was, dealing with the people in the great cities of the kingdoms. Instead, Micah was probably just an average guy out here in the normal everyday places where people lived and worked and carried out their activities. So we're going to be thinking about that as we travel on through his writing. Also remember that this is a very deceiving map here. It looks like a long way from Jerusalem over here to Moresheth Gath, but really that was only about maybe 25 miles or so southwest of Jerusalem, so maybe a day's journey or more. So he had access to those major cities. That's something we want to remember, that Micah was able to travel easily and quickly to the major cities in both Israel and Judah that needed his instruction. All right, so let's go back then. If we can exit out of our zooming process here. Now, back up to where we were. Moresheth Gath, like we said, located in Judah, about 25 miles southwest of Jerusalem. And remember, too, that this was, Gath, like we said, was on the border of the Philistine territory. And so here we have him being pretty much familiar with what the enemies of Israel were all about. Another thing is that it's in what's called the Shephelah. The Shephelah was an area, a region of Palestine, which was the beneficiary of some good flow from rivers and streams heading toward the Mediterranean Sea. And it was a very good, fertile place. It had good soil. It should be there. That's a wrong verb to use in this, but it lay within good farming country in the Shephelah. So it might be worth thinking about that perhaps Micah had some background in farming or some related industry. We don't know much about his actual occupation. Not told anything particular about that. Also, where he lived, Moresheth Gath, was near the great coastal road. There was a road, according to the Shaw Pocket Bible Handbook, that ran from Egypt to Mesopotamia, all up and down the western coast of Palestine, along the eastern coast of the Mediterranean, and that made it a very prosperous place to be, besides the farming and the husbandry that took place there. Probably Moresheth Gath was also a place where trade took place, and this man Micah would have known about places other than his place of residence. He would have known about what's taken place in Mesopotamia, maybe, or even as far down as Egypt. And in fact, this was a major road through which the armies passed, the armies that were traveling from south to north and north to south. Something to think about there, that Micah would have been able to see the great armies of the people of that time as they marched through his area. So then we come down to point 4, and we read, like Amos, Micah was a man of the country. You remember Amos, one of my favorites to study. We talked about how Amos was a shepherd, a keeper of sheep, and he sold his sheep and their products throughout the area. Also, he was a man who tended the sycamore fig trees and got them ready for consumption. And he lived in the country, so he wasn't, like we said, he wasn't a city person either. Micah here is also a man of the country who had time for thought and clear vision. I don't know, maybe that's true. What about country people today? Do us country folks have for thought and clear vision? Maybe so. There may be some benefit to living out from the pressures and the hubbub and the general mix-up of the popular areas. So maybe he had some advantage there. This comes from Nelson's Bible book, Book of Bible Maps and Charts. And so his opinion is at least that Micah, being in this country environment, had special ability because of where he lived. He could sit down and think about things and put together his thoughts. And like we said, nothing is known about his occupation. We were not told that he was a shepherd or a farmer or a businessman or anything else of that nature. When we talk about these prophets, we do need to realize that they're human beings. They're not some special spiritual entity that God brought into being for this purpose. Now, he does have a purpose for them, and he calls them to do his work. But by and large, these were just everyday people. They were human beings who did their thing to survive and live in their community and be a part of it. But then, in addition, they were tasked with this job to do that God had directed them. And when we talk about prophets and their inspiration, we want to remember that inspiration means God breathed. Doesn't necessarily mean that God breathed the exact message into them. That's part of it, of course, but also what happens is that God breathes into them the motivation. He gives them the impetus to go and do his will and preach his word and be strong and stand up for what they're speaking. So the prophetic realm is an interesting one. Let's take another look, though, at his character. When you take a person like Micah, with whom we don't know anything about his background, you have to rely on what he says about himself to get some hints about his character. So let's look at that in chapter 3 and verse 8. Micah makes this statement here. He's speaking about himself here. But truly I am full of power by the Spirit of the Lord, and of justice and might, to declare to Jacob his transgression, and to Israel his sin. When you see here, Amos he's describing this method by which God enabled him to do this work of a prophet. And number one, he needed power, for sure. There would be those who would oppose his message and those who'd ridicule him, and some would even try to harm him. But he was full of power, he says, and he mentions that it's by the Spirit of the Lord. In these days, we don't read all that much about the Holy Spirit, but he's referencing here the Spirit of the Lord, that entity of divinity that communicates. And so the Spirit of the Lord was what was communicating to him these things he was supposed to do. And he even spells out here some of the concepts that he was going to be delivering. He says, and of justice and might. Justice especially. God's justice, is what demands punishment for sin. And so these people in both Israel and Judah who were guilty of sinful behavior and departing from God's ways, they were going to face justice, judgment, if you will, for their sins. And also he proclaims might here. I think he's probably talking about the might of God. God's mighty power is there in order to bring about this justice if needed. But there's another way to look at it too. God's might also includes his mighty mercy, his great and powerful characteristic that God has and shows towards human beings. He shows mercy, and I believe that's part of it as well. You notice the last part of verse 8 there too. He says this is to declare to Jacob his transgression and to Israel his sin. When he uses the term Jacob there, it's usually referring to the kingdom of Judah, those two tribes in the south. The term Jacob refers to their connection, their constant connection in lineage back to Jacob and Abraham and Isaac, but also to Israel. So the 10 tribes in the north, the kingdom of Israel, is also going to be the recipient of this message to declare to Jacob his transgression and to Israel his sin. Transgression and sin are the same thing, but that's his statement about his character and what it was going to lead him to do. One of the things we notice here is from Nelson's Bible Encyclopedia. He puts it this way: blessed with Amos's passion for justice and Hosea's heart of love, Micah's spirit burned with indignation over how the city dwellers oppressed the peasants. Yet his teaching is not entirely unique. He echoes great truths proclaimed by his predecessors and contemporaries, especially Isaiah, who worked in Jerusalem. But if you take that very carefully, Micah kind of embodies the character of some of those previous prophets, like Amos. Amos had a passion for justice. He was the one who preached that people needed to go back to the Word and to learn it and be responsible about it. And Hosea, that great prophet who shows through his own personal experience with his wife leaving him and then coming back, the great love that he had and how that great love transmits to what God has. So Micah was a little bit different in that his spirit was one of indignation. We're going to see how he made quite a point of how the city dwellers, the princes and the well-to-do among society oppressed the peasants. This seemed to be a pretty common thing in those days, where those who were of higher status and more wealth and more power and more prestige were able to oppress the poor and squeeze even more out of them. So that's something we'll notice with Micah, his determination to bring that indignation out and let people know that God felt the same way about them mistreating the lower classes. And then we see here, yet his teaching is not entirely unique. Okay, he does have some of the same things that the others before him proclaimed, like Isaiah. In fact, I think in some part of this we're told that his writing is so similar to the book of Isaiah that Micah is sometimes called Isaiah in miniature. Interesting how that would be applied. We also know from the writing of a scholar named Deal, the style of writing that Micah uses is rough, like a peasant writer of his time. It portrays quick temperament and brisk change from one subject to another and from one person to another. Sometimes he is bold and stern and severe. At other times he drops into sorrowful, loving tones. So you can analyze the writing of someone and you can pick out phrases and ways of stating things that they use. And in Micah's case, first of all, the way that he was indignant over how the peasants were being treated, and then also he himself writes kind of like one of those peasants. We kind of gather that maybe when we say he was a man from the country, living out in the lesser populated areas, that one of the things he was responsible for was getting his message across in a way that people could understand, that they could follow. And so he wrote in that general rough manner of a prophet, of a peasant, I mean. And he was able to quickly shift as we read through the book. It's only 7 chapters, but he does a lot of switching back and forth from talking about one subject to another and then from one person to another. And also his attitude. Some things he says are very bold and severe and, driving home the point. Other times he proclaims kind of with sorrow and loving tones his message. So those are some interesting things. We also know that he was a contemporary of Isaiah. We're going to see that they kind of overlap in the time frame that they were writing and speaking, but their messages are very similar. And like we said earlier, some some scholars have said that the book of Micah is an Isaiah in miniature. Uh, some of the similarities are so strong that you can see how they're related. And so they were contemporaries with a similar message. But on the other hand, they were quite different. Like we said, Isaiah was a man of the city, one who was closely in contact with world affairs. So Isaiah, you could say, he rubbed elbows with the princes and with those in power. And the things that he said and wrote were directed toward those in those high positions. Isaiah was known for that he could navigate in those circles of the high and the prestigious. He was an associate, they might say, of kings and princes. He was also politically active. We don't get this much from Isaiah's writing, but some of the history connected with him. He was the leader of something called the Jehovah Party. These were the loyalists of his day, the right wing, if you will, who were very conservative and very closely linked with God's word and the law of Moses. And they were in opposition to many of the people of their time who wanted to be linked with the Assyrians or join up with the Egyptians and gain some strength and protection from them. So Micah here was different from that. Isaiah was politically active, being in opposition to these people who would ally with other cultures. But Micah was just a simple country man. We don't even know about his parents. Nothing is said there about who his mother and father were. A lot of times prophets will tell who they came from, where their roots lay, if you will. But Micah was he was just kind of an unknown in that respect. And he had no interest in politics. We don't read in his writing or from history about him that Micah had anything but a compassion for the people. And like we said, his compassion was for the oppressed. And then that leads to his great concern for the spiritual and moral problems of his people. So Micah's a good example of a simple man who has a heart that drives him to be concerned about the oppressed people, but also has this overriding concern for the people as a whole and what their condition is, their spiritual and moral condition. So as we think about these things, we want to understand that Micah was coming along pretty late in history. He was the last of the prophets to announce the doom of Israel. Israel up in the north there, the 10 tribes, in 722, 721 AD, BC, fell to the armies of Assyria. And there had been a long line of prophets that came and preached to them. Amos and Hosea were sent directly to Israel to prophesy. Isaiah and Micah here, on the other hand, were actually prophets of Judah. And what they were doing was pronouncing Israel's imminent destruction and relating that to what was going to happen to Judah if they didn't change. This is one of those good applications of teaching technique, if you will. Isaiah and Micah, though they were prophets in Judah, they used what was being seen and happening up in Israel to get their message down to the folks of Judah. And the others, like Amos and Hosea, they went directly into Israel. You remember how Amos lived in Judah, but he went up into Israel to preach, and the same with Hosea. But Micah and especially his relationship with Isaiah, they sort of held back and did their speaking down in Judah, but used Israel as one of those examples, trying to bring that in front of the people. And Micah was condemning in Judah the same things that Amos and Hosea had condemned in Israel. You remember when we studied Amos and Hosea, some of the things that they brought up as far as steps that led to the downfall of Israel was the way they treated the poor and the oppressed. Amos and Hosea both had that message about how Israel was going to be punished for that cruel treatment that the upper class had over the lower class. And here Micah is going to condemn the same thing. He has the ability to see what's happening there in Judah and relate it to what happened in Israel. And so he's going to be able to tell them, witness what's happening in Israel, and pretty quickly you're going to see them being destroyed, and the Assyrians may well be coming your way to carry out destruction on you as well. So he was the last of those prophets. He condemned the same things that Amos and Hosea had seen in Israel. Often what we like to do is get a good feel for the date of these prophetic writings. So as we wrap up our time this evening, we'll take a look at that and see if it fits with what we know about other things that are taking place in the Old Testament times. The date, we think that it's going to be somewhere between 735 and 700 BC. And what that shows us is that it would encompass the time right before the destruction of the kingdom of Israel and the taking of them captive by the Assyrians. And then it would go on past that a little ways. So we see that he's going to be able to use the destruction of Israel as something to be an example for the people of Judah. And of course that's variable. We don't know exactly the times, but here's one way that we can tell very closely. Micah himself dates the number of, or the kings in which the reigns he worked. I guess I said that wrong, but he spells out for us who was reigning during his time as a prophet. And so if you look back there at chapter 1 and verse 1, Micah explains there the time frame based on who was ruling in the kingdom at that time. And he's speaking here about kings of Judah. Like we said, he's referencing Israel and all that's happening there, but he's talking about himself now. And in Judah, here are the kings. Now let's read that. The word of the Lord that came to Micah of Moresheth in the days of Jotham, Ahaz, and Hezekiah, kings of Judah. All right, so if we go back and look at the reigns, which we can place pretty closely on these kings, Jotham reigned from 740 to 732 BC. Ahaz reigned from 732 to 716, and then Hezekiah from 716 to 687. So when Micah spells out these kings, you can see that that would encompass this period here, all the way from 735 in the middle of the reign of Jotham, all the way through the reign of Ahaz, and then into Hezekiah's reign, enough to show that it took place after the destruction of Israel. Well, this is interesting. We said that Micah was a contemporary of Isaiah, but they're not quite matched up perfectly. Micah evidently began prophesying a few years later than Isaiah did. And how do we know that? Well, let's again compare some kings. We go back to Isaiah, the first chapter. Turn back, but keep your place mark there in Micah, but go back to Isaiah, way back there where we've already studied. Isaiah, the first chapter. And here Isaiah tells us when his prophecy was being done. The vision of Isaiah, the son of Amos, which he saw concerning Judah and Jerusalem, in the days of Uzziah, Jotham, Ahaz, and Hezekiah, kings of Judah. So, according to Isaiah, he began prophesying in the reign of, let's go back up there, in the reign of Uzziah, who came just before Jotham. So Isaiah was already in the area and proclaiming God's message during the reign of the previous king. And then Isaiah says, I also continued through the reigns of Jotham, Ahaz, and Hezekiah. So Micah comes along in the reign of Jotham, and so here he is coming along a bit later than Isaiah. Although during that span of the last three kings, they would have been true contemporaries, working toward the same goal in the same place, but maybe speaking to a different audience. We also find that we know for sure that Micah began prophesying before the destruction of Samaria. Samaria was the capital city of Israel, the capital of the kingdom, and in 722 or 721, depending on which historical view you take, that's when Israel was taken captive and Samaria was destroyed. Actually, the 722 is probably when the Assyrian king made the siege of Samaria, and then it took over into 721 for that siege to completely inundate the city. And what Micah talks about here is that this destruction is coming, it's pending. And he began to prophesy during that time before the destruction, and then continued way on up into the reign of Hezekiah, which was after the destruction of Samaria and Israel. In Micah chapter 1, let's take a look at verses 5, 6, and 7. He writes here, "All this is for the transgression of Jacob, and for the sins of the house of Israel." What is the transgression of Jacob? Is it not Samaria? And what are the high places of Judah? Are they not Jerusalem? Therefore I will make Samaria a heap of ruins in the field, places for planting a vineyard. I will pour down her stones and into the valley. I will uncover her foundations. All her carved images shall be beaten to pieces, and her pay as a harlot shall be burned with the fire. All her idols I will lay desolate, for she gathered it from the pay of a harlot. They shall return to the pay of a harlot. All right, he's talking here about things that are going to happen in Israel before the destruction. So at this point in Micah's writing, he is telling the people, this is what we know is going to happen in Samaria/Israel. Or in chapter 6, he echoes kind of the same thing. Don't have time to read all of that, but if you start in chapter 6 and verse 9, and go all the way to the end of chapter 6, he is writing here about the things that are going to come. He references especially the works of Omri and Ahab, and we know that those were evil kings up in the days of the Israelites in the kingdom of Israel. So our time is about gone for this evening. We're going to stop here, and if you will mark there under the date, we're going to pick up with point number 3 for next time. And that will help us to kind of connect the dots here and see when this letter was written, when this book was put in place. We appreciate everyone's participation in our recorded Bible studies like this one. Remember that you're always welcome to put comments or questions into the comments section of our YouTube video. And also directly contact me if you have any questions about the content or anything that we bring up during the course of our Bible studies. And as we stop here, we're looking forward to Sunday, the Lord's Day this week, which will be the first Sunday of the new year, January the 3rd. We look forward to seeing you there if possible. If not, then we'll also have a recorded sermon from that date to have put on our website. Thank you for joining us. May God bless you, and may you have a good day. And thank you, and we'll see you next time.